I'd like to share just a brief introduction to Unit 3 that addresses the material in Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 through 13:13. We have seen the power of blessing and the intent of God in his instruction to Abram in the call is that God's ultimate goal is to bring blessing to the nations through the family of Abram. Through an amazing work, we talked about how this barren family departs from the world of high culture of southern Mesopotamia, going to first northern Mesopotamia around Haran, where Abram's father passes away, and then the call continues to go into the land of Canaan, the promised land that'll be described in various ways throughout the patriarchal narratives, and of course then later on, the parameters of the land will be set forth in various boundary lists that are described throughout the Pentateuch. So the patriarchal family has moved from the land of Canaan now in Genesis chapter 12 toward the land of Egypt because of famine. Famine in the land of Canaan was a recurring aspect of the climatology of this region. We have in Egyptian records, for example, a description of people groups coming out of the land of Canaan to Egypt during times of famine in order to procure food supply. So it was an intermittent occasion. We'll have a couple of others that will be mentioned in the patriarchal narrative, one in the Isaac material, and later on, that's how Israel ends up in Egypt, the sons of Jacob and company, toward the latter part of the book, as a result of recurring famine in the land over this century-plus length of the patriarchs living in the land. So the journey then down to Egypt, of course, also has a spiritual sense, and why it is included in several different aspects of the narrative, why it's included in this material after this great call in 12:1-3. Abraham goes through the land, journeyed. Later on, of course, he's going to talk about God instructs him to look and to journey, be walking through the land, which is another aspect we'll highlight in section 4. But he journeys through the land in somewhat rapid fashion. We're not told the exact time sequence. That's not important to the text at this point, but relatively soon after Abram and Sarah and company, with Lot and company, are all in the land, a famine occurs, and Egypt was the go-to place to buy food supply for short-term or long-term. And so the irregularity in Egypt of the overflow of the Nile River on an annual basis led to a highly productive agricultural world in the land of Egypt, that varieties of peoples or international groups would come into Egypt to buy food supplies. So, but in a spiritual sense, as Walke and others highlight, this is a journey out of the land of promise into a land where several negative things happen. The first of which, of course, as they're approaching Egypt, of course, Abram talking with Sarai, this description of her as a beautiful woman. We go down there, the Egyptians are going to see you, and they're going to sweep you away. So we're going to tell them that you're my sister. And Abram's actually, not totally trusting God with the full truth in the situation, and this plot to deceive in part Pharaoh is laid out. And of course, when they arrive, the Egyptians see her as a beautiful woman, and she is then taken into the harem of Pharaoh. After which, of course, God intervenes. The handiwork of God, in spite of Abram's weakness at this point, this plot to deceive the Egyptians, passing off her as his sister, which was kind of a half-truth, in order to protect himself. Again, his lack of faith is wanting to show us that Abram is not a perfect faith follower of this God that he's now following, that he is a person who is growing in faith. And so that's one of the intentional purposes of the narrative. We are not initially told how Pharaoh figures out, other than this plague. Typically, if we look at other passages in the Bible where plagues come upon a people, he would call together his priests, and they would go through various forms of divination and ways of trying to seek the will of the gods and why a plague or disaster or something has come upon a people. They would go through their typical means. But in the end, we're simply told that Pharaoh figures out that it is the deception of Abram that has led to. Now, of course, initially, Pharaoh blesses Abram with varieties of animals and more wealth than he brought with him down to Egypt. But the author, of course, here wants us to know that the resultant well-being of Abraham, Sarah, and company was part of God's blessing. God blesses sometimes, as he does in our lives, in spite of ourselves. Sometimes we can get in the way, but sometimes God blesses us in spite of our unfaithfulness. And Abram is blessed with livestock wealth, but he's also, in part, you might say, blessed because God intervenes, revealing to Pharaoh the issue of Sarah so that she is not brought fully into, so you don't have the language that she become not simply a person in the harem, she did not also become a sexual partner with the Pharaoh by the result of God's intervention in the revelation. So, after that, Abram, Sarah, and all of their company and their previous and newly found livestock blessing, they're moving out of the land. And chapter 13, we have the family going back to Canaan, back to the Negev where they left off in chapter 12, verse 10. And very quickly, as we described it before, this telescopic narrative, this quick movement in the geography, because it wants to link together, again, the narrative plot of the patriarchal stories is focused upon God's revelatory work, God's dealing with sometimes the waywardness of his followers, then to bring it back to the place of blessing. So the geography then moves back to Bethel, where Abram had previously built the altar. And again, that's what the narrative emphasizes. It wants to emphasize God revealing himself and interacting with his people. Again, the building of an altar, no doubt offering various types of sacrifices, of thanksgiving and consecration, burnt offerings, and so forth, were part of the normative way of engaging deity. But again, this is the point where God had revealed himself to Abram during his initial journey into the land. So the geography of the land of Canaan is going to be the faith setting for the narrative. And it's that same area around Bethel, of course, that Jacob will go to before he leaves, escaping Esau's wrath, and go to the land of the north, back to the land of their forefathers. Laban would have lived in Padan Aram, not far from Haran, which is in that general Aram Naharaim region. And then, of course, it's at Bethel that Jacob returns to, again, at the end of that sequence of his journey in and through the land. So that kind of gets us to the end of chapter 12 and into chapter 13. And then chapter 13, of course, continues then with the separation of Lot and Abraham's company. As described in your biblical text, that the land, which of course was occupied by various groups of people. It's not like there was an empty land. It's called the land of Canaan, but of course you know from the various lists, it's the land of not only the Canaanites, but the Girgashites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Horites, also known as the Hurrians, and other people groups. So it's a land that we talked about in the first week that had been the transmigration route for numerous peoples between Egypt and upper Mesopotamia, and also the region of Anatolia, the Hittite lands, and so forth, from ancient times, going back, we know, at least back into the Neolithic period. So as a result, numerous people groups stopped and stayed in the land of, broadly known as the land of Canaan. And so one of the things you have to look at in reading the geography of the book of Genesis and other places is that Canaan can refer to a specific people, ethnic group, or it can refer simply to the collective peoples living in the land. We have the same use of the term Amorite in the Old Testament as well. It's a specific people group, the Amuru people, but sometimes the land is also described as the land of the Amorites, who were also from upper Mesopotamia. So, in the end, of that area, at least that part of the text that describes in chapter 13 the division of Lot and company. It does want you, of course, set the stage, the reader, to remember or to note that as Lot has chosen, again, the various ways, and Walke in his commentary talks about Abram's concession to allow Lot to choose. Lot chooses the area down toward the Jordan Valley, called in the Hebrew the Kikar of the Jordan. And later on, when we have in chapter 14 beginning the kings from Mesopotamia that invade the land and come down into this area, it will describe 5 cities, the 5 cities of the Kikar of the Jordan. They're in this region that are attacked, goods that are taken, and not only goods, but also people taken in slavery by the kings. And of course, Abram will go to rescue them. But that's a little bit later in this text. So the choice of Sodom will, of course, be the choice of evil. So there's a symbolic use of Sodom, and of course, the sins of Sodom will later be outlined in our patriarchal narratives. And Abraham, again, acts on behalf of not only his family members of Lot, but also on behalf, pleading with God in that classic chapter of, if there are just 50 righteous or 40 righteous, God might deliver the people. But it was a land of unrighteousness, of sinfulness, that God is going to bring judgment. And so, again, this choice and this movement in towards Sodom, Gomorrah, and that region is a choice that shows Lot is moving away from God. Abram, then, at the end of that chapter, is again presented with God's promise of the land that he is able to lift up his eyes and see. Literally, this kind of marking off the land as a kind of legal contract between God and Abram about a future promise. One always has to make a distinction between issues of promise and issues of possession. There's always a difference. One, the promise is always there of God to Abraham and his descendants, but that promise does not always result in possession. Possession is dependent upon Israel's faithfulness in varying degrees. So that, when Abraham dies, what does he own? This land, from, Dan to Beersheba and beyond, from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. That's the promised land. But all he owns is a field that has a cave in which he buries his wife Sarah. But that was a start. The fulfillment of this, of course, will come in the Joshua conquest. But again, remember that a whole generation of Israel coming out of the Exodus, because of their rejection of the land and rejection of God's promise, they didn't possess it. It would accrue to the next generation to realize the fullness of God's blessing. In the same way, we have promises in the Bible, but if we are unfaithful, we may not experience that. Sometimes God blesses us in spite of our unfaithfulness, but God's plan is to bless those who faithfully follow him in spirit and in truth, and again, in being the Christ to our neighbors.